So musicians' dire financial circumstances are sometimes wrongly blamed on irresponsible spending, but until very recently, no data existed about what musicians in South Africa really earn, what costs they carry, and the tough trade-offs between professional and household cost that often need to make in order to survive. A musician's pension plan has been proposed as a solution. But the musicians need to earn to contribute to that fund. Gwen Ansell joins us now. She conducted research on jazz musicians and their financial state. Gwen, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for making time for us.
Good morning, Eldrin, and good morning to the Newzroom Afrika viewers.
Before we go into the details of the research, tell us about which myths the research also demystifies, because as we said in the introduction, a lot of the time we are told that the reason that you find artists dying poor is because of misspending.
Yes, that was one of the major things that we see in many media and have seen for many years, or in fact astonishment that musicians are not wealthier. And I think people get this from reports of perhaps a fee for a particular concert, or perhaps the earnings of one individual, particularly high-earning artist. But what we found when we did the survey was that artists earn round about the national average wage, which is, let's say, what a motor mechanic earns. But because they are not in formal job contracts, their work is project-based, they have to carry all their own costs. There are no allowances, there's no UIF, there are none of the things that anybody in a formal relationship with an employer would have to carry.
Yeah, and with that, of course, because now we live in a society where we speak about the gig economy. But how different is that for artists and how artists work? And we also noted, for instance, during the height of COVID-19, most of them couldn't find an income due to the lockdown and the restrictions that were placed on gatherings.
Yes, for artists, and this has been true now for perhaps close to half a century now, the main source of earnings, the thing at the top of the value chain for artists, is live performance. And although artists are, if you like, the original gig economy, I mean, that's where the term came from, during COVID, gigging was not possible. Travel was not possible, gatherings were not possible. So at a fell swoop, all their potential earnings for an indefinite period into the future from early 2019 were simply taken away.
Yeah, the research says that our survey revealed that real desperation and destitution for many individuals. Can you just unpack that a bit for us? What exactly is meant by this?
Yes, when we did the survey, we discovered that although the average earnings of a cohort who skewed older, who were more experienced perhaps than the music industry overall, but nevertheless, people were having to choose between music and paying school fees, selling instruments and feeding the family. We had stories of people who lost band members to COVID, and then when things began to recover, they had to renegotiate those relationships with a new, younger cohort of collaborators. We had people telling us about how the relief fund, and I should make it clear that the original purpose of this research was to work out how an extremely well-structured Swiss musicians relief fund actually functioned. But we had people telling us that the relief fund allowed them to buy medications, for example, which they would not have otherwise been able to buy, or to support a younger family member, a daughter who had lost a job. It was those kinds of things that we kept hearing in the open portions of the survey that we ran.
Yeah, I find the reference to collaborators and the death of collaborators interesting, because a lot of the time we don't speak about the economic value of relationships and having access to a network. And once that network gets depleted or some of the members leave that particular network, the difficulty in having to find somebody to replace that network. But outside of just the formal agreement between party A and party B is also a relationship that has been built, that sometimes that I'm willing to do work for you without being compensated necessarily, just on the basis of the relationship that we've established?
Oh, absolutely. And we found that the erosion of those relationships by what COVID did, it wasn't just between musicians who perhaps lost band members, but a number of the hubs that musicians depend on, venues, studios, those kinds of places, had also either closed down or had suffered such severe losses themselves that the kinds of relationships that people had had before, where allowances were made, where trade-offs were made, where quid pro quos were offered, none of that seemed to have been possible after COVID because of the losses that occurred right through the music ecosystem. And this meant, for example, we had people telling us that fees had not only not risen since COVID, but had actually fallen. That people who ran, for example, a 5-piece band were now being asked to bring a 3-piece band to an event because the venue could not afford to pay for more. So that social capital was incredibly weakened by what happened to everybody on the music ecosystem during COVID.
And financially, from an economic perspective, what has that impact been from the music industry in general? I know that the focus here was on jazz musicians. But even if we do just focus on jazz musicians, do we know from a GDP perspective what that impact was?
Well, nobody looks at the GDP of musicians as musicians. This is one of the reasons that our research is so groundbreaking. People look at how the industry is doing. And that normally means the big players within the industry, the record labels, entertainment broadcasters, streamers, those kinds of things. Very, very little research throughout the world looks at artists. And I have to say, although our research cohort was artists, in fact, we did some fairly extensive desk study of facts and figures that had been produced by musicians' organizations around the world. And the situation, the pressures, the costs, the problems were the same across all genres. So we're pretty confident that what we are saying is actually truer for musicians broadly, even if the precise figures relate only to the people that we surveyed. Yep. And yes, there is no national survey of how much individual musicians put into the national economy. And yet, let's remember, they are taxpayers if they earn enough. They put their kids into schools, they buy goods, they buy services. There's actually quite a large multiplier effect whereby they use the services of other people, attire makers, drivers, sound engineers. So they're very much knitted into the fabric of the economy. But very few people look at what those individual musicians actually earn and how they have to spend it.
Yeah, your research also looks at the total income earned by all grant applicants pre-COVID and at the time of applying for the grant. And if you look at those figures, 15.5 million, it dropped to 3.2 million.
Yes, and it was, I mean, the word devastating has been used all around the world for the impact of COVID on the entertainment industry as a whole. And that devastation actually hits even harder when you're looking at the level of an individual musician's household, which still has to survive as a household, as well as that person having to stay skilled, keep their instruments. A large number of people reported having to sell instruments and to sell equipment. And of course, when things got back to so-called normal, as well as all the other catching up they had to do, the debts they had to repay, they might have had to repurchase instruments simply in order to function at all.
Yep. Let's look at some of the proposals that you are making, including a reform of the tax regimes around musicians' tools of trade. How do you see something like that being implemented?
Well, if you look at how music instruments, I'm not talking now about signed equipment, which is another tax regime on its own. If you look at music instruments, because of certain beliefs that orchestral music was superior, the tax rate on stringed instruments is lower. Many other music instruments are actually taxed at a luxury rate. We don't have a significantly sized music instrument manufacturing sector in this country, which is something incoming governments of national whatever might like to consider. But all of these things, all of these costs actually need to be factored into looking at how musicians are taxed, how the purchase and import of their instruments are taxed, how things like a home studio is taxed. You can get relief on a home office. It's far less clear that you can get relief on a home studio. And yet these days, many musicians make their entire recorded and video output out of their own home studio. So those kinds of considerations are extremely important. And also just looking at costs of working. And again, there's worldwide research on this from musicians' organizations. What we have is a cost of working crisis. And if both fees and taxation took more into account what the musicians' costs of working were, tools of trade, call it that, and it just sounds like any other worker, that really needs to be taken into account.
Yeah. And then from the financial institution side, I'm not too sure whether the report actually looked at that particular aspect, because here it is. We live in a society where the economy is essentially driven by debt. For an individual to buy a house, which is perhaps for the majority of people who own assets, the biggest asset is going to be a house. However, though, musicians as artists find it difficult even to secure a home loan to build a house, a home.
Absolutely. And one of the issues here, and it also became apparent when we looked at the other types of COVID relief, particularly government COVID relief that were available at this time. I can understand why, but there is a demand for vast amounts of formal documentation. If you operate in the gig economy, you may well not have that type of formal documentation. Those of us who are freelance journalists, for example, know that these days we may well get an engagement through a WhatsApp message. There won't be a contract. And those kinds of things are very largely not accepted by institutions or by government facilities as proofs of earning or proofs of spending. So I think one of the things that was really splendid about this relief fund, which was run by the Joburg branch of the Swiss Arts Council, Pro Helvetia, was that it actually trusted musicians to provide the types of proofs that they had and not seeking any other proofs that most musicians do not have.
Yeah, I know that in our introduction we spoke about demystifying some of the myths, including that musicians cannot handle their finances. But there is an important point in a discussion I think that needs to be had around financial literacy for musicians, and also understanding, for instance, the contracts that they go into. How does SAMRO apply to all of this? But I see the suggestion that you do make, though, is the support of the psychological well-being. What about the financial literacy that is required as well?
Oh, I think that is something that has actually been spoken about for a long time. Remember that the musicians we interviewed were largely people who had more than 9 years of experience. Many of them were actually very sussed about how to manage their income. They simply didn't have an income to manage, which is slightly different. But I would say any music program at any institution of higher education certainly ought to have a music business financial literacy element within it. I think that's extremely important. I'd agree with you entirely about that.
Yeah. What's your proposal to the government of what, as you called it a bit earlier on, the government of national unity?
Yes, the government of national what? I don't think we have any very clear notion of how it's going to turn out.
So whoever becomes the Minister of Arts and Culture, what should he be doing?
Well,
or she
so
be doing?
few of the parties even mentioned arts and culture in their manifestos that I have quite a doomy feeling about what may happen next. But nevertheless, I would say that the impact of costs of working, when government is running events, and let's remember that government does run quite a lot of events, that needs to be taken into account. I think grant-making instruments, whether it's from government or from other donor bodies, need to actually have sustainable, targeted grant-making instruments that actually look at these issues and actually factor in the fact that this is a self-contained project. It's not going to turn somebody into a self-reliant, independent business person on the strength of, let's say, 3 months' work. I think de-siloing is very, very important, and this is not so much at the national government level, but at the local government level. We have people planning transport, for example, which we discovered was a major cost. We had musicians saying they had to turn down gigs because getting the band and the equipment there was going to cost more than they would earn. But the people planning transport at local government level don't necessarily talk to the arts and culture people. They don't necessarily talk to the licensing people. They don't necessarily talk to those people who are responsible for zoning and liquor licensing. And if there was more de-siloing of these very, very tight little local government responsibilities, perhaps some better planning that serves the music economy, the night economy, could actually be developed. So I think that's something. And I would say also, bridging the digital divide. It comes up in every piece of research. We've done half a dozen pieces of research on the music industry in the last couple of years. Digital costs are now working costs for musicians. They cannot collaborate, they cannot record, they cannot post their music without access to affordable, accessible digital requirements. And of course, electricity, though we're not talking about that at the moment, we're just keeping our fingers crossed.
Yeah, and as your research indicates, that transport and communication accounts for 30% of the expenses incurred by musicians. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.